The Sun Yuan are also known as the Sun Bao. Some people know them as the Sun Ti Dao. Basically, the three essentials, or the three origins, or the three treasures. It's all just basically different descriptors and slightly different perspectives on what is essentially the same idea. They're basically three components of existence which combine to create ourself and our environment. They have both prenatal and postnatal configurations, if you will. The self, it's determined by the prenatal Sun Yuan. So in other words, the prenatal influence of these three essential components of existence. The environment, on the other hand, is determined by the postnatal Sun Yuan. So in other words, the three components of existence as they interact with the self after birth. So as a result of that, the self and the environment form a dynamic relationship, and that can be either balanced or unbalanced, or it can motivate you to be a certain way, or it can encourage certain health habits, or point to the risk of certain health issues. But it's this essential interaction between the prenatal qi of the self and the postnatal qi of the environment that creates this wonderful complexity of life and behavior and diversity of existence and experience. So let's look and see how all of this is developed. So the three essentials are essentially heaven, human, and earth. Tian Di Ren. Sometimes that's also known as Jing Qi Shen if we're looking at it from a very personal perspective. But on a broader, larger perspective, right, we're talking about heaven, human, and earth, the three levels of experience or of existence. Heaven is basically related to time, okay? So the heavenly qi is really the qi of time. Okay, and we know that qi changes from moment to moment. The seasons change. Even within a season, the quality of the various months are different from one another. And then, of course, we have the qi of a day, right, which changes, and the hours themselves can have different qi qualities. And of course, if we broaden our perspective, then the years can change qualitatively from year to year. And this is basically recorded and essentially laid out in what is known as Bazi, or the 8 characters. So the year has a heavenly stem and an earthly branch, and then the month has a heavenly stem and an earthly branch. The day also has a heavenly stem and an earthly branch, and the hour has a heavenly stem and an earthly branch. And that totals 8 characters, which essentially create like a energetic timestamp. Okay, so it basically is a timestamp which describes the quality of qi of a particular time that includes the year, the month, the day, and the hour. So heavenly qi is the qi of time. Human qi is essentially your behavior. It's a person's behavior. It's the relationships you have, the interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships. It's the things you eat, the things you do, the things you don't do, the medicines you take, the poisons you ingest, whatever. It's that kind of qi. It's at the human level. So it's qi that you interact with and take in from the environment, or even put out into the environment. And then earth is the qi of physical space. It's feng shui. Okay, it's the qi of your environment, but not in sort of this dynamic, sort of interactive way, such as the human level. This is much more the qualitative qi of geography, of space, of the shape of the land and the shape of the buildings and the shapes of the things around you and their qualities. So it's feng shui. So heaven is about time, human is about behavior, and earth is basically about feng shui. And so these are the 3 levels. Now, how do these 3 levels come about? Well, we start with the wuji, right, which is the void. And then that forms the taiyi, or the great oneness, where we basically start to have limit, if you will. Okay, so we start to have some shape to it, or some definition. The great oneness becomes the huangji, or the grand extremity. Once we have one thing, then we can actually make relatively opposite comparison in that one thing. We have one, and we can have the inside and the outside, or the top and the bottom, or whatever we want. And so that is basically huangji. Huangji becomes Taiji, where now you have within that grand extremity the concept of there not being anything absolute, and so they are parts of a singular whole, and there's dynamic interaction, dynamic relationship within whatever great oneness you are actually talking about, whether it's the universe, or whether it's a person, or whether it is a relationship, or whatever. So Taiji comes from Huang Qi, and then Taiji, we have the idea of there being dynamic change, and we have the idea of there being extremities, but also relationship between those extremities. And so the extremities are looked at as being Tai Yang, or great Yang, and Tai Yin as great Yin, and they come together at the Taiji in a great unity, and there is dynamic interaction between them. Now, Tai Yang, in and of itself, is a Tai Yi, a great oneness. And so Tai Yi, the great oneness of Yang, can actually become a Huang Ji, where even within the great Yang, we can differentiate between things that are more Yang or less Yang, and we do. We talk about Xiao Yang, which is little Yang, and Tai Yang, which is great Yang. And then we have dynamic interaction between them, so we can have Taiji within Yang. And the same goes for Yin. Within Tai Yin, that's a great oneness, and we can divide that into Huang Ji, and then Huang Ji becomes Tai Ji. So within Tai Yin, we have Xiao Yin and Tai Yin, and we can actually look at the dynamic relationships that Tai Yin and Xiao Yin actually have. So it means that each component of either the Tai Yang, the Tai Yin, or the Tai Ji, which is basically the intersection of Tai Yang and Tai Yin, all three of them, they can further be broken down, if you will, into Tai Ji. And then what happens is that we actually can look at that now as, rather than just being Tai Yang, we can just say, well, that's Yang, all kinds of Yang, and then we have Yin, all kinds of Yin, and then we have Qi in the middle, okay, Yin Yang and Qi. And that basically is what this graphic depicts. Now, Yin Yang and Qi is correspondent to heaven, human, and earth. So heaven is of course Yang, earth is of course Yin, and human is the Qi level. And so we have these three different levels, and each level has its own plethora of transformations and interactions and all of that stuff. Now, we also know that as soon as you have Taiji, as soon as you have change, then you can actually look at phases of change. And so each one of those levels can actually be looked at from a 5-element perspective, where you can actually have the 5 elements of heaven Qi, or we can have the 5 elements of human Qi, or the 5 elements of earth Qi. So for heaven Qi, for instance, right, let's take a really simple example. In a day, we have noon, which would be more the fire phase of the day, and we have midnight, which would be the water phase of the day. Or for earth, right, we could have, for instance, we could have a forest, right, which would be more a wood type environment, or we could have a mountain, which would be a more earth type environment. And then in the human level, we have the 5 elements playing out in all kinds of different ways. We could look at it in terms of the foods that you're eating. You could be eating fire foods, or earth foods, or water foods, in terms of their flavors, right? Bitter or sweet or salty. You can also look at it in terms of the emotions that someone is actually expressing, or is being exposed to, either from themselves or from those around them. And you can also look at it in terms of therapies, right? In terms of what medicines a person is being exposed to. Are they being exposed to herbs, or are they being exposed to moxa, or are they being exposed to bloodletting, or acupuncture, or massage? These are the sort of the different phases that exist within the heaven, human, and earth levels. So with this understanding, we can now begin to explore how these 3 types of Qi, earth Qi, human Qi, and heaven Qi, actually play a role in shaping the qualities of prenatal Qi. The first one that a lot of people think about is ancestry. And it's true, ancestry is a vital component of the sort of 3 levels. Prenatal Earthly Qi is essentially your genetic ancestry. And why would we place it there? That's because our ancestors, whoever they may be, evolved certain physical and adaptive traits based on the land they lived on. And, you know, in this post-industrial world we live in, we have sometimes a hard time understanding that our ancestors spent generations, multitudes of generations living in the same environment. So they developed adaptations to that environment. The next one is prenatal human qi, and that is the in utero environment. So regardless of who your ancestors are, right, if your mom is an alcoholic, well, that's going to obviously have some effect on what your prenatal human qi ends up being. What kind of influences, right, are you experiencing in utero? So at this level, certain traits are basically decided upon, such as gender. So prenatal human qi is just that. It's the in utero environment, and it plays as important a role in the development of your prenatal Yuan Qi as does your genetic ancestry. And finally, we have Prenatal Heavenly Qi. So Prenatal Heavenly Qi is basically, it's described by a person's bazi or birth chart. But what that birth chart is it's a timestamp of sorts of the moment that a person's prenatal influences stopped changing and the person switched from being a prenatal only being to actually coming out into the world, to being born, and now all of a sudden they're being exposed to postnatal types of qi. So the moment that you take your first breath is the moment that you start being under the influence of postnatal qi. Your prenatal qi becomes set in stone. It crystallizes, if you will. And the qi of time, the prenatal heavenly qi that exists at that moment that you take your first breath, it crystallizes and becomes a part of you. And so that heavenly qi ends up becoming a part of your prenatal Yuan Qi. So all three of those together combine, right? The prenatal earthly qi, the prenatal human qi, and the prenatal heavenly qi, they all combine together to essentially give the Yuan Qi of your body a very unique quality that is entirely and uniquely your own. Now, this Yuan Qi is now a part of you. That is you. That is yourself, if you will. And now you start to become affected by the postnatal world. So we have postnatal earthly qi, and that, of course, would be Feng Shui, the environment that you're living in. How is that interacting with your prenatal qi? Let's say you end up having very, very wood type Yuan Qi quality. So you have a wood constitution, and you have a lot of wood in your prenatal heavenly qi. And now you end up, moving into a forested area. That might actually be too much wood for you, okay? And so that interaction might cause problems. So the interaction between the prenatal qi and the postnatal qi, it's a balancing act. We want to be able to have postnatal experiences that are going to protect the prenatal qi against decay, and that are going to also allow us to be one with ourselves and to allow us to actually thrive in our true nature. So Feng Shui is postnatal earthly qi. Postnatal human qi is Yang Shengfa. It is the things that you eat, the things that you do, the people that you interact with, the medicines that you take, and it too plays a vital role in your overall life experience, but it too will create a specific dynamic between the prenatal qi depending on what your constitution is, depending on whether or not you are a man or a woman, depending on whether or not you, again, have a lot of fire qi or not a lot of earth qi, depending on whether or not a particular element is useful or harmful to you. All of these things play a role in determining what kind of activities, foods, relationships, and medicines you'll be engaging in. And again, we want to be able to select the foods and the Yang Shengfa that are going to guard against decay and that are going to allow us to really allow our original nature to thrive. And finally, we have postnatal heavenly qi, and that is calendrical qi. It's the flow of time. So again, right, every moment in time has a particular qi quality to it, and that qi quality will then again interact with our prenatal qi, and that will in turn, right, be either more useful or more harmful in terms of whether or not it's going to slow down or accelerate decay, or whether or not it's going to impede or encourage us to actually manifest our true natures. Now, something to point out is that out of all of these three postnatal qi categories, Feng Shui can be changed. We can choose the environment we live in. Yang Shengfa, human qi, can be changed. We can choose the behaviors and activities and foods and relationships that we engage in. Heavenly qi, calendrical qi, time, cannot be changed. And that is the one thing that we do not have the ability to manipulate. We have to basically just go with the flow. And this is why Bazi is an integral part of a person's life and their health, their well-being, and their ability to guard against decay and to manifest their true nature. So because calendrical qi cannot be changed, it becomes vital to understand it and to know how that particular qi of time is interacting with your prenatal qi, and then to engage in postnatal human qi and postnatal earthly qi environments that are going to create a whole harmony with the whole setup. So that's why we want to be able to understand what our prenatal qi is in order to best be able to understand how the calendrical qi interacts with us, so that we can then engage in proper Yang Shengfa and proper Feng Shui remedies. So I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. That's it for now. Have a great day.